Our scripture passage for today is one that is commonly read at weddings. You remember what a wedding is, don't you? We haven't been to one in a while. People stop having weddings for a couple of years. But when we get back to having weddings, we will no doubt hear this passage read. The 13th chapter of Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. We call it the love passage. Why? Well, that's what it talks about, isn't it? It talks about love. The word love, in my translation, appears 9 times in this chapter. Verse 4 is practically a Hallmark card in its own right. There we read, love is patient. Love is kind. This is the sort of love that we celebrate. This is the sort of love that we desire. When we go to a wedding, it's about love, isn't it? So it may surprise you that marriage was the last thing on Paul's mind when he wrote these words. Because he wasn't writing to two people who were in love. He was writing to a congregation. A congregation in Corinth that was deeply divided and on the verge of falling apart. Now, Paul was a Christian missionary, and as a missionary, he traveled the known world, establishing worshiping congregations in different towns. He did this in the city of Corinth. Like in other cities, he arrived in Corinth, he gathered a group of people, he taught them about Jesus Christ, he established a church, a worshiping community, and then he would move on to the next mission opportunity. In Paul's day, the city of Corinth was a Roman colony. And because of its location on a very narrow strip of land between two seas, it tied two large pieces of land together. It was an important and prosperous trading center. A lot of merchants would bring their items in on a ship on one side of the isthmus and transport it to another ship so as to avoid having to go all the way around this large body of land. Some people had small boats. They just dragged the whole boat across. Medium-sized boats, they actually had a sort of rail system set up. Fascinating stuff. But because of its importance as a trading center, the city was exceptionally prosperous. It had a population that's estimated to have been between 100 and 600,000 people. The population was diverse with Romans and Greeks and a lot of folks from the east who came as traders. And all of these inhabitants, they brought with them what? Their gods. Their many gods and idols. And so Corinth had no shortage of shrines and idols to various gods. One scholar has described Corinth as being, quote, intellectually alert, materially prosperous, and morally corrupt. So, Paul came to Corinth because it was an important city. There were lots of folks there. And he gathered a group together, taught them about Jesus, forged his community, and then, as I said, he moved on to the next mission opportunity. Time goes by since his departure, but Paul stays in contact with that church in Corinth, and he's received word that there are troubles brewing. There are divisions among the members, and these divisions are quite numerous. For example, there's the matter of communion. How could anybody get upset at communion? Well, for this church and for churches of the time, communion was not little wafers of bread and shot glasses. It was an actual meal, a love feast, we would call it. And everybody brought their own meal. They brown bagged it for church that day. But it wasn't a shared event. People just ate what they brought. And the problem was that the wealthy folks would bring these sumptuous picnics of lobster and caviar and champagne, while the poor, they were getting by with their peanut butter crackers. This obvious disparity of wealth was a source of great contention within the church. And then there was another matter regarding food. Some in the church considered it okay to purchase meat that had been previously sacrificed to a pagan idol. With all those shrines and temples in Corinth and people making meat sacrifices, a lot of the meat found its way into the marketplace. And some of the folks in the congregation went, it's just meat. Others found this to be highly offensive, and so they avoided this practice. That was a matter of contention. And then on top of that, it appears that some members were bringing lawsuits against other members. They were also split over which evangelist or preacher that they were going to follow in Paul's absence. We even read in chapter 5 of some matters of sexual immorality. And it's a wonder, given all this, that Paul just doesn't wash his hands of the whole group and walk away. But he doesn't. He sticks with them. And even though he could not be with them in person, he maintains a correspondence which we call 1st and 2nd Corinthians. Actually, 1st and 2nd Corinthians are just two of at least 4 letters that we are aware of. We don't have these letters, but we have references to them in the other 2 letters. So we have these 4 letters that Paul has written to the congregation. And in this correspondence, Paul does all that he can to heal these divisions and bring the church together. He acts like an attorney. He builds his case, and a case which culminates here in chapter 13 in our reading for today. A case that culminates in Paul's plea to the people to live in love. Now, in English, we've got just one word for love. There are other words like passion, fondness, care, but really there's only one love. In the Greco-Roman world of Paul's day, they had more than one word. They had several word choices for love that conveyed its meaning according to the context in which it was being used. For example, there is the word philos, which describes a close friendship. The city of Philadelphia was named by its founder, William Penn, as the city of brotherly love. This name comes from philo for love and adelphos for brother. Philo, adelphos, Philadelphia. There's also the word storge, which is the love that we have for family, especially the primal protective love of a parent for a child. There's also eros, which describes sexual passion, the root of our word erotic. And then there's the love that Paul calls the Corinthians to strive for. Not philos or storge or eros, no. Paul uses the word agape. Agape is a deep, willful, sacrificial, unconditional, self-giving love. In Latin, this word is translated to caritas, which forms the root of our word charity. So caritas or agape are sacrificial, giving love. The author C.S. Lewis describes agape as, quote, gift love. I love that. Gift love. Paul writes to the people of Corinth and calls them to set aside their differences and calls them to demonstrate their agape love for one another, to give of themselves for others. Now, these aren't all the issues that are going on in the church in Corinth. Another, it appears there was an underlying competition about who was the best Christian in the church. And some members were clearly trying to outdo others. For example, there was the matter of speaking in tongues. Apparently, it was all the rage. And if one wants to demonstrate just how spiritual they are, there's no better way than to speak in tongues. The more, the better. However, this tongue speaking had become a disruptive force within the congregation because not everybody believed in it. So Paul's solution is to ask that those who speak in tongues root it within a foundation of love. He writes these words: "If I speak in the language of mortals or the language of angels, but do so without agape, I am nothing more than a noisy gong, just making noise." He goes on to say the same about those who claim prophetic powers or those who make generous donations to help the needy. Those acts, no matter how well intentioned, unless they are rooted in agape, have little meaning or purpose in the Christian life. So what is it about this agape that makes it so special? I mean, well, for one thing, he thinks of it differently than we do. For us, we think of love as being a noun. Love is a thing. Love is a good feeling. It's a special bond. It's an attachment to something. But for Paul, love is much more. Agape is a verb. And not just any verb, but Paul views it as an action verb. In fact, in Paul's world, love is like an action hero, like Bruce Willis or Arnold or Sigourney Weaver chasing aliens through space. People who will go to any length to do what needs to be done for the greater good. According to Paul, agape love is patient. It is kind. It is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. You notice Paul's not employing abstract adjectives here. He is calling on these action verbs to describe agape. Agape means to be patient, to act kindly, to rejoice, to bear, to believe, to hope, to endure. Agape is powerful. Paul offers 15 action verbs to describe just how powerful agape is. And furthermore, agape love is eternal. There are other spiritual gifts, such as prophecy or tongue speaking or knowledge of the mysteries of God and the cosmos. But these things, Paul says, they're all going to come to an end one day. But not love. Love will outlast them all. Agape will last forever. So what Paul is proposing to this deeply conflicted church is that they now engage in a radical communal agape. And they need to shift from putting their own priorities first and instead seek to put others ahead of themselves. Paul is asking these people to imagine life in a community where each person truly cares for the others. He's asking them to live the love that Christ told us is in fact the acting out of God's love for this world. The people in Corinth need to live God's agape. They need to live in a new reality, a new possibility, a new kingdom. They need to love like they are action heroes. Finally, Paul explains that the changes to their church that are needed are not going to happen overnight. They can't just flip a switch and make it all better. No, this change that he's calling for requires, transformation on their part. It requires that they grow and mature. And Paul talks about himself here. He says, when I was a child, I acted like a child. I spoke, thought, and reasoned like a child would. And what we don't know here, if Paul is being literal and talking about when he was actually a child, or if he's being metaphorical and talking about the time before he knew Christ, but it doesn't matter. Because either way, to think like he does now, to come to the point in his life where he is now, requires change and transformation. It requires time and growth and experience and maturity. To be a Christian requires a transformation that continues our entire life. And Paul is telling the people that they are going to need this time to mature as well. Presently, he says, they are viewing the world as if it is reflected in a mirror. On a historical note, their mirrors were not nearly as good as ours. Our mirrors are about perfect. Theirs were probably some sort of hammered metal that was shiny, and you could see a vague reflection of yourself, kind of like looking at yourself, reflection in a spoon. Who's ever done that? So we might say looking through a smoky glass, because the reflection they saw, well, it was dim. It was far less than perfect. But one day, Paul promises, one day, if they learn to love, they are going to see not a dim image, but a perfect image, just as if they are speaking face to face with God. As I mentioned, Paul did not write this chapter intending it to become a wedding liturgy, but since we do read it at almost every wedding, there is no reason we cannot apply agape to our own relationships. And we should, shouldn't we? A marriage has a far better chance of survival if the partners successfully set aside their own selfishness and replace it with the sacrificial and giving love. As the old joke says, marriage is when a man and a woman become one. The trouble starts when they try to decide which one. The author Louis de Bernay, in his novel called Captain Corelli's Mandolin, has a scene where a father explains to his daughter about love. The daughter's a young woman, and she's fallen in love with a dashing army officer. And the father offers words to her that convey his own lifetime of experience. He starts off by saying, when you fall in love, it's a temporary madness. It erupts like an earthquake, and then it subsides. And he goes on telling her more about love and his experience and what love is, but what he ends with these wonderful words. He says, love itself is what is left over when being in love has burned away. We are called to be Christians. And to be a Christian is not to pray the loudest or work the hardest or sing the loudest or speak in tongues or any other outward work. Being a Christian is who we are in our hearts. And Paul calls us here to embrace agape fully in our hearts so that we might become those Christians who love, who give, who embrace, who are welcome to the joys of this world. So I encourage you to go out and meet this world with the love of God, that wonderful agape that changes all things. Amen.